Last week's speaker. Then we should do it every week. That's last week think about it. Go on.
All right, I'm very pleased to welcome Tom Vogl. Tom is an associate professor of economics at UC San Diego, a development economist and an economic demographer. He studies health and population issues in low and middle income countries. His recent research has focused on the intergenerational persistence of child mortality, the aggregate consequences of differential fertility, the long-term impacts of conditional cash transfer programs, and the dynamics of poverty decline. He's a co-editor at the Journal of Development Economics and recently served as a deputy editor at Demography. He previously taught at UT Austin and Princeton and received his AB from Princeton and PhD from Harvard. Please welcome.
Okay. Welcome, Tom.
Great. Well, thank you
Take it
for
away.
having me here. This is so great. It's been a long time since I was at Berkeley, actually, and I guess I gave this brown bag 9 years ago. When Ted graciously hosted me during my mid-assistant professor leave. So it's great to be back here, and it's great to be around so many demographers. I was just telling Josh and Aisha that down at UCSD, there are lots of great economists, but not a lot of people thinking about demography. So it's nice to be here. Okay, so this paper I'm going to tell you about started out as a review paper I was supposed to write for the African Economic Research Consortium, who asked me to say something about how fertility change interacts with human capital growth in Africa. As usual, I'm not very good at writing review papers. I always end up wanting to do some data work, and so it turned into a project of its own, which I think of as more of a demography project than an econ project. So this is the perfect audience to get to that. Okay, so a bit of background. Let's see if this works. So the starting point for thinking about these questions is what John Bongartz called Africa's unique fertility transition, right? Where sub-Saharan Africa has had later onset of fertility decline. It's had slower onset than other world regions. And alongside that, it has also had slower education growth than other regions around the world. And so sort of the starting point for this descriptive research paper is to ask, like, how are those two facts interconnected? There's a good deal of good reasons to. Oh, so here, sorry, let me show you some basic time series facts. So here is total fertility rates over time. As I'm sure many of you know, sub-Saharan, even though many other regions in the global south started experiencing fertility decline in the 60s and 70s, it took until the 1980s for sub-Saharan Africa to start showing any signs of region-wide fertility decline. And on the other side of things, if we think about rising educational attainment over time, this is actually kind of, I think this figure is kind of tragic because sub-Saharan Africa used to be mixed in with other regions like the Middle East and North Africa and Central and South Asia, but in the last couple of decades, it's sort of fallen behind these other regions. And so like big picture question is, are these two things related to each other? So there are good reasons to think that they might be related to each other. Any economist looking at these would think first of Gary Becker's work. This is the so-called Pauli-Quanli trade-off, the idea that if you invest more in your kids, it becomes more expensive to have more of them. If you have more of them, it becomes more expensive to invest in them, right? Education is a primary outcome of investing in one's children, so we might think that these two things are linked. Around the same time that Becker was working on these ideas with Lewis, Jack Caldwell was thinking about some related issues. He has a piece in PDR from 1980 where he argues that math education is crucial for initiating fertility decline. He had a number of reasons, some of which had a lot of overlap with Becker's reasoning about how having kids in school changes the cost of children. But he had also many ideas about how schools sort of spread Western values and change wealth flows between generations in a way that wasn't fully captured in what Becker was writing. Anyway, but these two ideas broadly sort of suggest that the expansion of schooling may be closely linked in the same generation with the reduction of fertility. Now, there's another side of education and fertility linkages that maybe many of you have thought about also, which is that it's commonly thought that increasing adults' education, particularly the education of women, is crucial for leading fertility decline. And I think actually these three things can't be thought of separately. But if you want to think about how parents are changing their quality and quantity investments in children, you also need to think about how much education the parents have. So these I'm going to talk about an education fertility triangle, which basically has education in 2 generations and fertility decisions. And I'm going to argue that we want to think about them all at the same time. Okay, so big picture implication is that if we want to think about the future of education in sub-Saharan Africa, which is a super important topic for thinking about the future of global poverty and economic growth, then I'm going to argue that we should be thinking about what's going to happen to fertility. And on the flip side of that, if we want to think about the future of population in sub-Saharan Africa, it's crucial to think about what's happening to education. And sub-Saharan Africa is destined to become the world's most populous region within the next half century. So these are important questions. This pitch is for economists who don't think about population that much. I don't think I need to convince you that we should care. Okay. So today, what I'm going to do is basically try to chart out a series of facts from place cohorts in Africa, so either subnational region cohorts or national cohorts, to think about how is it possible to
if we just mute entirely the people on Zoom, that's not a bad thing during the seminar. We'll
They have to mute themselves. I can turn them
go
off.
up to the view.
There we go. That's good. That's right. I'm easily distracted. At UCSD, we have military jets flying over campus every hour or so, and whenever it happens, I completely lose my train of thought. I have to start class over again. Okay, so the goal here is to basically set out some facts on cohort fertility change and cohort educational change within this thing I'm calling the education fertility triangle, right? And so I'm going to be interested in thinking about how fertility changes within a place across cohorts. And how that relates to changes in adult educational attainment and how that relates to changes in children's schooling outcomes, the children of the adults whose education and fertility we're thinking about. Okay? And so the goal here is basically to set out a series of systematic facts about cohort fertility change and cohort educational change on the continent. So I'm not trying to estimate particular causal effects, but I think that these descriptive facts about the coevolution in these 2 domains can be really useful as we generate specific research questions relating to the interconnections of education and fertility. Okay. So let me give you a quick preview of what I'm going to show you, and then I'll try to dive into the data as quickly as I can. So one big takeaway is that the facts you get from this cohort panel, where you're looking at groups of women who were born in a particular place in different years, different periods of birth, those panel facts are a lot more nuanced than the facts you would get just from looking at aggregate time series or just from looking at cross sections, right? So the cross sections look exactly as we would expect, where wherever there's more education, there's less fertility, regardless of which generation you look at. When you look at sort of within place changes, the picture becomes more nuanced in a way that I think is actually kind of interesting and motivates us to think a little bit more about exactly what about schooling reflects parental investment and what about schooling doesn't reflect parental investment. In particular, in these panels, it's kind of difficult to find evidence that decreased fertility, falling fertility is associated with increasing child investment. Okay? And what I mean about that is that at least my first go-to schooling outcome to look at is enrollment as a non-education researcher. And fertility change in Africa over the past 30 years or so is not associated with changes in school enrollment. And that's sort of the surprising thing, right? When I then learned some more about actually properly measuring kids' educational outcomes, I realized that ideally we would want to look at learning outcomes, but we don't have great data on those. But at the very least, we might be interested in thinking about grade attainment or progression through school. And once you look at grade attainment, you do find that places that have experienced more fertility decline have experienced more rapid increases in grade attainment for age. Yeah.
Quick question, how should we think about the supply side in this? So, this is sort of about the demand, right? How should we be thinking about the supply?
Yeah, for sure. So there are these, massive programs to try to increase primary schooling in Africa. It's the phenomenon that Lance Richard likes to call butts in seats, right? So you put kids in classrooms and they may not be learning much and they may not be progressing much through school. And that's absolutely something we should be thinking about. Yeah, absolutely. Let's get back to it after we look at the data. Yeah.
So school enrollment is indicative of primary, or what do you define as school?
I'm going to be looking at kids between age 7 and 14. And that's mainly because those are the ages that I can consistently measure it in all of the demographic health service I'll be looking at. And so some of those kids that's, I guess, mostly primary school, but there will be some early secondary school.
Do you have any evidence from parents asking them how much schooling do they want their children to have?
I don't think the DHS has that. They have a lot of questions about how many kids do you want. I don't think many questions about how many.
That's kind of what we would want if we're thinking about the quantity quality trade-off for parents, right?
Maybe.
Because they're making the quantity decision way before they're making, simultaneous with the intended quality.
Yeah.
Intended quality as a realization.
Yeah. Okay, so why is this? Why are these two measures of schooling outcomes diverging from each other? I'm going to argue that it has to do with a more general decoupling of enrollment and attainment, which in part has to do with that fact that I told you that there's been this big push to put butts in seats, but not as big a push to have those kids learn something. And it interacts with parents' educational attainment in interesting ways. So it turns out, this is not surprising to anyone in this room, that increases in women's educational attainment are associated with decreases in fertility. I think that's sort of an expected outcome. Increases in men's attainment, but not women's attainment, are associated with increases in enrollment, right? So you have, when dads have more education, their kids are more likely to be in school. When moms have more education, they're more likely to have smaller families, and both men's and women's are associated with increases in grade for age, right? And so mechanically, in sort of approximate sense, right, this sort of gives us an anatomy of why I fail to find an association between fertility change and enrollment change. Yeah.
It's possible. Another thing that's happening here is these families are smaller, the kids are spaced out farther apart. The health of the health investment, intentional or not, so the infant is larger.
Yeah.
And the cognitive capacity of that infant's larger as their nutrition is better.
Yeah.
So I mean, part of it is like the enrollment and performance in school have different inputs.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
I think that's exactly right. I think more general, I mean, there's a general question about like how we think about nutrition in this framework as well, right? Which would be interesting in its own right. But more generally, right, if it's just that, you have a massive primary school program that puts kids in school, but it takes parents adding something to actually push the kids through school, then we would think that that grade attainment would be a closer proxy for those parental investments. It might come through nutrition, it might come through other. I will say, I'll get back to this at the end, but Caldwell had all these ideas about how having mass schooling, having kids in schools would change how the local society thought about childbearing. The results that I'm showing today are a little harder to square with that theory, unless having kids in school and not progressing doesn't socialize them as much. Right? Anyway, so I will get back to that later in the talk. I don't have anything definitive to say about that, but I do think it's interesting to think of it in that way. Okay, we can't see my.
Can you just shrink your slide a tiny bit?
I'm not sure I can. I'll just tell you about it. Oh, there we go. Yeah, look at that. I had no idea that was possible. There we go. Okay. This question about enrollment versus attainment, I think that's sort of a really interesting thing to think about. I'm not going to fully resolve this, but I do think it's something that I would like to think about more in the future. There's one sense in which we're putting butts in seats and we're not pushing kids through school. And so maybe just, grade for age is just doing a better job at measuring a single latent variable, right? But there's another sense in which maybe grade for age is picking up parental investments, right? So that it's a conceptually distinct outcome, right? It's sort of interesting. There's this old paper in Population Development Review by Cynthia Lloyd and co-authors thinking about this Caldwell hypothesis on mass education and fertility decline. I would characterize their paper as sort of a cross-sectional version of what I'm doing in panel data. But more to the point I was just making, they actually threw out enrollment data altogether because they thought it was useless to think about enrollment in Sub-Saharan Africa, and they only looked at primary attainment. So they sort of anticipated what I struggled with some 20 years later. But I guess the sort of interesting thing to think about is whether there's some interesting conceptual content there, or whether it's just simply a measurement issue. The final thing I want to say before getting into the data is that there's something else lurking underneath here, which I haven't tackled yet, but is certainly interesting to think about. David Lamb has this old work with Leticia Martoletto, where they make the point that just at the moment when family sizes start shrinking because of fertility decline, you have often the largest cohort of women giving birth, right? And so that means that you could have small families, but actually very large primary school classes, right? At the same time as you're scaling up primary education. And so that can lead to all sorts of crowding effects that are entirely consistent with this idea that we're putting butts in seats but not educating.
Is the return on education different in Sub-Saharan Africa than the rest of the world?
That's a very interesting question that you can get lots and lots of answers for. I would say that the evidence that the returns to education are different is relatively weak. Does that sound? I have other comments in the room.
There aren't a ton of very credible estimates, I would say. There's
That's
a
right.
few in
That's
Sub-Saharan.
right. That's right.
Better ones are in Asia.
Yes, that's right. And so the ones in Asia are not strikingly different from ones we get elsewhere.
I mean, the way I think of what's happening in a lot of the world is you had an elite educational system, and then when you had the expansion of education, the cachet of that elite system carried over. And so people want to send their kids to school. Maybe there's even a misunderstanding that maybe school isn't worth what it used to be because it wasn't this elite system. And I don't imagine that in Africa, but maybe I have the wrong picture in mind.
I think that's right. I'm not sure we can debate whether that characterization applies to other cases. Yeah.
When I think about these relationships in Sub-Saharan Africa at a crude level, I think of this huge rural-urban distinction, where fertility has dropped so fast in the urban areas, and it's dropping much more slowly in the rural areas. And the returns to education may be very different. I would suggest that they're actually higher in urban areas, so that makes this more of a puzzle. But there's also the sort of opportunity cost of time may be different. There's different things going on in terms of crowding, in terms of the rural to urban migration that could be affecting these. So when you're talking about these big cohorts, I mean, I would love to see all of this just untied.
So one thing that's really challenging about the data I'll be using, which are the demographic and health surveys, is that they do a poor job at helping you figure out migration histories, which means that if you condition on where people are living right now, it gets hard to interpret because there's a ton of selection there. And so I haven't pushed that hard on the urban-rural gap.
But you can stratify everything by rural urban in you can create cohorts based on current residents.
Yeah, but that reflects endogenous decisions where to live, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But
yeah. Well, let me show you what I have. I can tell you that in early versions of this, the patterns were largely similar when I did incorporate information on organization. But maybe it's worth bringing back in. Okay, so let me first tell you why I think we do need to, like, why when I sat down to write this review paper for the ARC, I was dissatisfied and felt like we needed some more facts. The conventional way to look at these patterns is, in period data that come from cross-country data sets. Okay, and so all I'm doing here is I'm relating total fertility rate and children's school enrollment rates in primary and secondary school to women's schooling. And then what I have here is I'm just taking these variables and projecting them on each other, so that all I'm looking at here is gross enrollment. So these are basically everything projected onto women's schooling, right? And then over here, it's common to run regressions of fertility on schooling or schooling on fertility. And I just wanted to show you what happens if we project these axes onto this axis, right? And so you get something expected, which is that more women's education is associated with lower fertility and higher children's enrollment, and higher fertility is associated with lower enrollment. These are not reflecting at all like the effect of quantity on quality or quality on quantity. This is like an outcome of a joint optimization problem, how we should think. Now, the dissatisfying thing about this is that we don't really want to be thinking about periods here, right? So this first point is just that, yeah, maybe it would be nice to know something about cohort completed fertility, but I actually think it's a little deeper than that in this case, because if we want to be thinking about this through the lens of parents choosing how many kids to have and how much to invest in them or how much education to give them, we really want to be thinking about the same families, right? And the kids who are representing this gross enrollment rate have parents from many, many different cohorts, right? They might in fact have mothers who are outside the 15 to 49 age range, right? So the parents of these children are not the same as the parents who are represented in this fertility aggregate, and that seems like a big problem, especially if you want to track within country changes, because you're tracking within country changes without a clear definition of what the population is. So that's going to be the main goal for approaching this using survey data. And I've made the point where we don't really want to use these gross enrollment rates, which are available for many countries in the World Development Indicators, and maybe we want to learn something about enrollment or grade for age. And then, these, especially given this problem of different aggregates representing different groups of families, it's hard to make sense of these cross-sectional patterns. It's hard to turn these period data into an interpretable panel data set, right? So I do think if we want to learn about some facts about fertility decline, then we really want to study these within country changes or within place changes, and the survey data are going to allow us to do that. One remaining problem is that there's a ton of questions about what exactly is driving these patterns, right? And I'm just going to throw up my hands and say I'm not going to try to disentangle some causal effect. I just want to do a careful job of documenting how these demographic and educational variables co-evolve during the process so basically at the onset of fertility. All right, so I've talked enough without actual microdata. So let me tell you a bit about microdata. So I'm going to use data from the demographic and health surveys. This is basically from the early 1990s to present. I'm going to look at data from 33 countries that have at least 2 surveys. So I'm going to require them to have at least 2 surveys because I'm interested in studying changes across cohorts. I did a fair bit of work to generate harmonized subnational boundaries for these DHSs, because the early DHSs don't have GPS markers in them, and so you have to work to get the maps to match each other over time. So we're going to basically form these cohorts where we either define a place as one of the 33 countries or as one of the 198 subnational regions. And so we have about 200,000 women in their 40s. and about 300,000 kids born to who were born to those women. Okay. Now, the age ranges here are sort of interesting to think about. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do think that there's an interesting sort of sample composition issue here, which is that if you look at the different age ranges of women in the sample, right? Naturally, you have the largest number of women in the youngest age category because the population is growing a ton in Africa, right? And of course, you get more. You get, of course, fertility. So this is at least one child ever born, and the average number of children and surviving children. Of course, that's rising over time. And so if you want to have some sense of completed fertility, you probably want to look at the end of this reproductive period, right? But then if we want to look at whether those kids are in school and how much school they've gotten, right? And the DHS restricts us to looking at kids who are between ages 7 and 14, then it turns out that the women that we want in the sample are different from the women that we want in the sample for studying fertility, right? Because this is the share of women with at least one child aged 7 to 14 that peaks in the late 30s, right? And then starts to trail off again. Whereas we learn the most about fertility, in the late 40s, right? And alongside that, the composition of those kids is going to be changing over the women's life cycle as well, right? If we want to think about the mother's age at the birth of these 7 to 14-year-olds, right? That's going to be monotonically increasing. I mean, that's just mechanical, right? Because we're surveying them, and so a 45 to 49-year-old with a 7 to 14-year-old at home would have had that kid in their mid-30s, whereas a 30 to 34-year-old, that should say 34, would have had that kid in her early 20s, right? And of course, there are systematic differences in birth order as well, right? So these kids are different depending on which moms you include, right? And this is just because you don't get a full roster of all the kids with their educational attainment, you just get to learn about the kids who are currently of schooling age. And these patterns are exactly the same for co-resident children, not just all children. I'm not going to dwell on that. Okay, so what I'm going to end up doing is I'm just going to look at fertility at age 40. I'm going to look at children overborn and surviving children at age 40 for all women who are over 40. Okay, there are, I have moved this threshold around, and the same qualitative patterns show up no matter how you compose the sample. But I find this group to be more useful because obviously, the variance of the number of children ever born changes a lot as you move into earlier and earlier ages, and so the interpretation of the results gets a little harder to work with. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this because I'm running short on time. What I'm going to do is form these national cohorts, which are going to be surveyed by mother's birth or woman's birth cohort cells. Okay. And separately, I'm going to form these regional cohorts, which are just going to be, these survey cohort cells split into subnational regions. Okay. And when I analyze the national cohorts, I'm going to include country and cohort fixed effects. We're going to be basically thinking about as fertility changes within the country across cohorts, what happens to children's education. And for the regional cohorts, I'm going to include region fixed effects and survey by cohort fixed effects. Okay, so this basically, these survey by cohort fixed effects, you can think of them as being a slightly more restrictive version of a country cohort fixed effect, right? So whereas here we're asking what happens like across Africa, do countries that undergo more fertility decline have a greater increase in children's schooling? Here we're asking within a country, do regions experiencing more fertility decline experience more child schooling? So these survey cohort fixed effects are sweeping away all the country level variation that's in the national cohort analysis. And so these are useful for different things. Neither of them is perfect. The national cohort analysis is going to be susceptible to the standard sorts of cross-country confounding that we usually worry about in cross-country regressions, right? The regional cohort analysis is more satisfying in that way, but because of this thing where you don't actually get to know where people migrated from, right? And in many surveys, you don't even get to know if they migrated at all in their lives, right? It's going to be more susceptible to migrant selection. Right? So I think actually looking at these both at the same time is going to be useful. If we get a similar story from both sources of variation, it's going to make us more confident.
Sorry, I may be misunderstanding, but you're saying you're at national courts, you're putting in country fixed effects, but yet you're seeing country level changes? Am I misunderstanding?
I have a country fixed effect
Yeah.
and I have a cohort fixed effect. Right? And so the remaining variation is within country within country within country cross cohort changes, right? Yeah, and then for the regional cohorts, it's within region, okay, but it's only comparing regions within the same country, and it's not doing any cross country comparison.
I think it'd almost be clearer, Tom, to call it country cohort. I understand it's one DHS survey, but
Yeah,
it does feel confusing what you really are doing.
yeah, it's really effectively serving as a country
It's a
cohort.
country cohort.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I'm doing it separately by survey because I find it, yeah, this is, it might actually make sense to just make it a country cohort effect to make it clear to people.
Yeah, you're saying that the same cohort could have been surveyed in different DHS. rounds.
Exactly,
That's
and
what
I'm being flexible about it, but
even if it's cohorts, survey cohort, it's really country survey. Cohort.
that's right.
Maybe
Exactly.
clear to say.
Yes, I actually used to, and I thought it was a mouthful, so I printed it survey. But yes, you're absolutely right. So maybe I should change that. I think Ted Miguel is a good judge of whether my writing is bad. Okay, so here are some descriptive statistics. I guess, how am I doing on time? You want me to end something?
So we go into, our last question should be at 10 minutes after, so that's half an hour from now. So if we want 15 minutes of discussion, you could finish in 15 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to finish this minute. That's fine. That's less bad when okay, so what I've done here is I've constructed, the summary statistics for women, and then summary statistics for their kids, just so we understand like what these two samples are doing and how they relate to each other. Right? So I have about 200,000 women, right? From 112 surveys, 200 regions, 30 countries, right? On average, they have almost 6 kids at age 40, of which almost 5 have survived. And if you then look at the children born to this cohort of mothers, right? There are about 300,000 of them. They are not born to all of these women, right? Instead, it's a subset of these women are their mothers, about 140,000 of them. Those women, unsurprisingly, have higher fertility than the overall sample, right? Because we're selecting on having children of a certain age. And they are less educated and their husbands are less educated. About 3/4 of kids of these 7 to 14-year-old kids are in school, and on average, they've completed about 2.5 years, 2.5 grades. Okay. So these means on schooling outcomes are especially interesting to disaggregate by age, and that's the next thing I'm going to do to make this point that enrollment and attainment mean different things. So here you see the enrollment patterns. There's a slight increasing slope here as kids enter school from age 7 to 9, then sort of flattens out, right? And as one might expect, if you look at average grade attainment by age, it's increasing with age, right? That makes sense. But it's increasing with age. These are 45-degree lines here, these grid lines. If we average for all children, grade for age is increasing less than 1-for-1 with age, right? Now, some of that is because not all of these kids are enrolled, but even if we condition on kids who are currently enrolled in school, the slope is still substantially less than 1, right? So these kids are gaining less than 1 grade of school for each age that they're in school. And some of this is going in and out of school, right? But a lot of it we think is also just being in school, but not progressing to the appropriate grade. So that's some useful context on what exactly we learn from enrollment and attainment. Okay, so this is my attempt to do something similar with the survey data that I did with the cross-country data. Okay, so you can think of these as like pooled cross sections, basically. The blue curve and scatter plot is this thing keeps yelling at me. Our survey means and the our survey cohort means, or these are actually survey cohort names, country survey cohort names, and the orange ones are region survey stuff. Sorry, these are actually for the entire survey for all women aged 40 to 49, taking an average, right, at the survey level and at the region survey level. And you see here patterns as we would expect. In this pooled cross-section, children's grade attainment and enrollment is increasing with women's attainment, children avoidance decreasing, and there's a negative relationship between children's schooling outcomes and mothers' fertility. So that's like a cross-sectional fact based on these data, right? Cross space. Right? We could also think about the cohort effects in the variables we care about, and that's the next thing I'm going to do. So here, what I'm doing is I'm just running a regression of each of these variables on country dummies and birth cohort dummies. The woman's birth cohort. Okay? And so here you see some patterns in reported actualized fertility and ideal fertility, right? So somewhat interestingly, the stated ideal number of children is monotonically decreasing across cohorts, right? Children ever born is decreasing a little bit less. It starts decreasing a little bit later, but also shows a clear pattern of decline. Whereas the surviving number of children sort of goes up a little bit and then comes down, such that this cohort effect is significantly negative, but it's obviously a lot smaller in absolute terms than so that's what's happening to fertility. Alongside that, both women's education and their husband's education is very strikingly rising across cohorts. And the school enrollment and grade completion of their children is also rising, right? So this also paints a picture that like education in both generations, as education in both generations rises, fertility is falling, right? So both the cross-sectional, the cross-sectional across space facts and the cohort time series facts point to this consistent thing where men's and women's education rises, fertility falls, and children's enrollment and grade attainment both increase. And so the next thing I'm going to do is to, I'm going to skip this map because I don't have a ton of time, so I'll just show you the regression.
One quick question on attainment. Is that similar across birth orders? So for like firstborn versus secondborn and girls versus boys?
The results are extremely similar for girls and boys, that I can tell you. For birth orders, that is an interesting question, and I have some other projects where I've thought about birth order, but I haven't done it here. So I don't know what the answer is.
So with all these fixed effects, I'm having trouble thinking about the variation. Is it that we holding like a child age 7 to a woman age 40 was born when the woman was 43, whereas I mean it seems like you're and I think in this context of stopping and spacing behavior, are we really getting, is that what you're kind of seeing here? The women who had less fertility, it's because they stopped at age 33 or 35 and therefore you only get one of their kids. Maybe this is for later, but
I think we should talk about it later. Okay. There's one question of whether I can do something differently here to answer your question, and maybe I can. I can tell you that if I don't include like the child sex and age indicators, the patterns look the same. But I think you might be asking a question about a more fundamental problem that's harder to address, and I'd be up for talking more about that. Let me actually dwell on the maps because they tell actually the story for the whole rest of the talk. Okay, so up here we have the countries, and down here we have the regions. Okay, you can choose which set of maps to focus on because they both sets actually tell similar stories. Okay, so all I'm doing here is I just compute rates of change in each of these variables across cohorts. Okay, so places that are red here are experiencing the most rapid cross cohort fertility decline. Okay, and places that are yellow are experiencing slower cross cohort fertility decline. Okay, and over here the blue areas are experiencing the most rapid, the steepest increases in women's educational attainment, and the lighter areas are experiencing slower increases. And the same here for children's enrollment and children's grade grade. Okay? And so what you can see here is that these three maps, 1, 2, and 3, both up here and down here, right, seem pretty similar, right? So the places that are experiencing the largest growth in women's educational attainment are the places that are experiencing the most rapid fertility decline, right? And that, I'd say, is pretty much consistent with what demographers would expect, right? It's consistent with everything John Baumgartner has written about fertility change in Africa, right? But the kind of surprising thing is that the places that have been experiencing a lot of progress in children's schooling outcomes, they don't look like they're the same places that have been experiencing these changes, right? And that's the sort of striking thing here, right? And the way in which these maps sort of tell the story for the whole rest of the paper. So basically, the rest of the paper is just going to be putting some point estimates on these facts. Okay, so let me show you what I'm going to do with women's outcomes. So I'm going to form these cells, which are either survey by country by birth cohort cells, okay, or region by survey by birth cohort cells, okay. And I'm going to regress, say, a woman's fertility outcome, average fertility on average women's education and place fixed effects and birth cohort fixed effects, right? And so the exact nature of the birth cohort fixed effects depends on the region or national level of variation, right? But it's in exactly the way I told you about before. We're here in the region analysis. I'm interacting the birth cohort dummy with a survey dummy, with a country survey dummy, so that we're only doing comparisons within a country. Okay, and so I'm going to start by looking just at women's education inside this X, and then I'm going to add a bunch of stuff about her marriage, right? Average husband's education in the cell, and then just to shore up any concerns about a variation in the share married, possibly affecting how we should think about husband's education. I'm just going to control in the background for the share currently and never married. That is not tremendously important, but I thought it was, that is not practically important, but I thought it was conceptually important. Okay, so here's what we get for women's education and realized and stated ideal fertility. Okay, quite consistent results from both sources of variation. Basically, an additional year of women's education on average decreases children overborn, surviving children, and ideal number of children by about 2/10. Right? Very striking, and actually, these slopes are actually quite similar to the slopes you would get from those cross-section cross-section plots I showed you a few slides ago. I'm not sure if people will find this surprising or not, but this for the most part, except for a little bit for ideal family size, this for the most part loads onto women's education and not on husband's education. Right? So this is something that's specific to women. So I think of this as sort of an important component of thinking about the relationship between parents' quality choices and quantity choices, because if we're thinking about things through a Vicarian framework, the costs of quantity and quality may vary across the parental skill distribution, and so this is an important thing to have in the background. Even though it's not a totally novel result, I think it's an important part of the discussion. But let me get to the other parts of that triangle. Okay, for the other parts of that triangle, I'm going to be looking at children's schooling outcomes. And so here I'm again going to take averages for survey by country by birth cohort. This again is the woman's birth cohort, right? And I'm going to be looking at the averages in her kids. And this is, I think, where Josh is going to be a little unhappy with me, because there is a lot of variation in these outcomes, systematic variation by children's ages, right? And depending on when you survey women, you're going to end up with very different compositions of child ages. And so I wanted to sweep out that age composition of children. And so here, instead of forming an overall average for the mother's cohort cell, I'm going to split up those cells into separate subcells for each child age. So that's why I've added these age superscripts here. These are for the child's age. Okay. It's just a somewhat more careful way to deal with the fact that you don't want to be comparing a group of women who have all 13-year-olds with a group of women who have all 7-year-olds, right? And so then I'm basically going to interact all the fixed effects with the child age size. And
The
then,
fertility variable is like, how many older sibs does the child have?
no, these are not varied by age. These are still measured at the mother's cohort level, right? So this is the average, say, if we're running a regression, that favorite unidentified regression of mine of children's schooling outcomes on mother's fertility, right? This is the average fertility of all of the women in that birth cohort, regardless of whether they have kids in the sample. Which I think is how we want to be doing things. I think we don't want to be conditioning the fertility variable on whether the woman has a child of school age right now. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is tell you about the relationship between average average adult schooling and average kids schooling outcomes. And here's where things start to get interesting. Okay, we do find that as women's education increases on average, the grade attainment of their kids increases on average, grade for age, right? By, a 1 year increase in women's average education is associated with like a, 0.15 year grade increase in children's grade for age. And that, of course, is going to be larger for older kids than it's for younger kids. So this is mixing together older and younger kids, right? So this is a fairly strong relationship. But you see up here for school enrollment, the effects are quite small, and in the case of the national cohorts, statistically insignificant. Matters get even worse when we include the dads. All of any semblance of a relationship between women's schooling growth and children's enrollment growth, all loads onto men's education. Okay, so net of dad's education, mom's education doesn't seem to matter for children's enrollment. That's not so true for grade completion, where you get it loading onto both women's and men's over here. Same is true to some extent in the national cohorts. This is imprecisely estimated, but the coefficient is still pretty big. Right? So it seems like rising men's and women's education is associated with rising children's grade attainment, but women's education is not associated with schooling. Okay? So these are telling us different things. That's the bottom line here. And then, unsurprisingly, if we want to ask, as fertility falls across cohorts within a place, what happens to children's schooling outcomes, right? It's then not that surprising. So we know that rising women's education is strongly associated with fertility decline, right? And we know that rising women's education is not strongly associated with changes in school enrollment, right? And so it stands to reason then that changes in fertility are not strongly associated with changes in school enrollment, whether you do this at the national cohort level or at the regional cohort level. The one exception is if you look at this reported ideal family size, but if you look at realized fertility, there's just nothing there. Right? On the flip side of that, if you look at grade completion, things look more consistent with what I think we would all expect, that as fertility falls, this measure of schooling outcomes improves, right? So this, I guess, this is consistent with a Becker type story where parents are investing more in their kids as fertility falls, right? That again is like a joint optimization outcome, right? We shouldn't be thinking of that as a constant step, right? But enrollment here is doing a very poor job of proxying for that kind of investment. Yeah.
Just like a quick question. How should we think about the differences between the magnitude of the parameters on the national cohort versus the magnitude of the parameters?
Yeah, that's a very reasonable question. I don't have a great answer for that. Other than it being very convenient that all three of these numbers look very similar to each other, and that's intellectually quite satisfying. Whereas, I mean, the national ones, I mean, they just have enormous standard errors, right? So they are much less precisely estimated, and that makes sense because we have many fewer.
Should get to your conclusions.
Yes. Let me just instead, I'm not going to conclude on a word slide. I'm just going to conclude by adding in 2 more columns here to make the point that if we leave out these fixed effects, so that we're doing effectively the comparison I was doing in those scatter plots I drew, these relationships are huge, right? And very much present for enrollment, right? And so the cross-sectional data would lead us to conclude that school enrollment is very closely linked with fertility, whereas if we look at changes, which I think we should be thinking about if we're interested in the process of fertility decline, that relationship disappears for enrollment. Okay, and I'll put up my final slide, but I will allow us to start talking about things. I've talked about everything like already, so there's not much.
Yeah, make it more challenging for the questioners. That's good. Okay, thank you very much. The room. So this is a test. If you don't conclude on your conclusion slide, do you get questions? I say, Will.
I just want to come back to the migration issue. And I was wondering, could you do these with census data, at least in some countries? I just pulled up the Kenya census and it has, you know, your place of birth, it has where you were in the previous period, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah, so from census data, you would have less information on things like ideal family size and stuff like that, right? And my sense is that from sub-Saharan Africa, the density of censuses is somewhat lower, and you get a much large, you get to cover a lot more of the region with the DHSs, because they just exist and were collected more frequently than censuses. But open question number 3 over here is whether these patterns are similar in other regions as they undergo the onset of fertility decline. And so one thing I'm working on right now using census data is asking these questions in Latin America, where I actually think there's a ton of stuff you can do, which allow you to deal much better with migration. And also, given that you're able to deal much better with migration, will hopefully allow me to leverage some natural experiments in schooling expansion and so on.
I just really worry about this composition or urban versus rural issues. It conflates so many things, and the supply side issues are so different in urban versus rural. And so at least if you could go into a couple of countries and estimate this in subset of countries and look at the parallel thing in the census data. I feel much better if you could show me that all these results are robust to teasing out urban versus rural based on, say, place of birth.
Thanks.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Look at women's education. Could you also look at the literacy? I know they have questions in the DHS about if you could read like part of a sentence or a whole sentence.
Yeah.
Did you look at
I haven't. I don't remember. I have it, and I looked at it early in the project, and did not find anything that struck me as important to mark out. But it would be worth revisiting. That is closer to a measure of learning than years.
I was, maybe you already said this, but how do you think about women that don't have children? Are you dropping them out, or
No, they're in there. Certainly for the fertility aggregates, they're in there. For the fertility aggregates and for the average education aggregates, they're in there. It's an interesting, if we're thinking about joint decision making over how many kids to have and how much to invest in kids, it is a perennial problem to think about what to do about how to think about the child investment choices of people who choose not to have kids, right? And in some of my past work on differential fertility, I have tried to make up what would have happened if people who didn't have kids actually had kids, which is an exercise in science fiction that actually made my physician dad laugh at me one time.
We have a question from our Zoom audience.
Anyway, that's
Guy?
a good bottom line. That's a very good question, and we're thinking more about it. Guy, yes, I'm listening.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very interesting. So I'm trying to think of the difference between husbands and wives, but also the complex household structure. So we have in some regions a lot of polygamous households or a non-trivial number, and I'm just wondering how that might play out, given that then the men's, there's some sort of and maybe there's something that you could tease out, because the men's effect is spread out over multiple children, over multiple mothers, and whether there's something you could do with that.
Yeah, the one thing, the thing that kept me from digging more into polygamy, obviously, polygamy is a very prominent feature of marriage in many of these countries. measured changes in polygamy were not large enough to have it play an important role in any of this variation. So, given that that the main focus here is on cross-cohort changes, right? There are some, there are nice papers on changes in polygamy in the prevalence of polygyny, but that variation ends up being too small to play much of a role in the patterns I'm documenting here. And so that's sort of, I'm not sure if that's if that answers your question exactly, or if you were looking for a more conceptual answer to your question.
Right. No, I guess I was imagining if you had done this in regions where there was and wasn't, where then it might be a difference.
That's an excellent question. I should do it. That's a great idea. Thank you.
So what do you think misled Caldwell? I mean, he was doing a lot of field work. He's also doing a lot of data work. Is there any insight you have there?
So, I mean, one thing is, so Caldwell thought by putting kids in schools, you're going to be making them more expensive. Those were like 2 of the 5 ideas he wrote down, right? But then he also wrote that they're going to be coming home with new ideas about what families are supposed to look like and so on. And I guess it's possible that that socialization process is stronger when kids are progressing more through school, right? Because they're actually gaining something from school and not just sitting there, right? So these are consistent with Caldwell, but the big picture takeaway from Caldwell was that when you put a bunch of kids in school all at the same time, then fertility change starts to happen. So I don't think it's necessarily inconsistent, but it takes a little more work to tie these patterns with Caldwell than it does to tie them with Becker.
Maybe going back to Will's point, can you classify the parents by the kind of professions they're in and how useful child labor might be, like rural agricultural households? Sort of rural, urban, just agricultural households, because that's, if I remember Caldwell correctly, that's a big part of it. The child is in school, therefore the child is not contributing home labor.
Yeah. There's probably more I could do. The DHS doesn't do a ton on measuring the type of work people are doing, but I should think about it some more.
Does Celine Zipfel's work doesn't she focus on that issue exactly? Agricultural households, differential patterns.
Yeah, so she's really interested in rural areas in the absence of paid formal sector work, right? The absence of jobs. So Celine is more focused on cross-sectional differences, right? At a point in time, right? Yeah.
Okay, last question. You started by saying Sub-Saharan Africa is an outlier in terms of education and fertility. Are there any hints from your research on why it's an outlier, or is it basically just this is why we should study it and learn more? But is there any kind of message we should be getting out of this of suggesting why the dynamic might be playing out differently, or are you by and large finding the dynamic is similar and therefore we shouldn't look at some unusual relationship between the two as an explanation?
So with the caveat that I haven't done exactly this kind of cohort-based analysis in other contexts as well, I think that the patterns do suggest that it is broadly similar to what we would expect to find in other contexts as well, with the exception being that having kids in school does not seem to be the same thing as having kids make progress in school. I'm not sure that holds everywhere. Yeah.
I'm just thinking back about the first question about Caldwell, but most of Caldwell's research was during the 70s and 80s. And the general context was very different in terms of education, women's labor for participation, diffusion of Western ideas, and things like that. So he might very well have been right for his time, but things are different now, and he didn't,
In fact, Caldwell's first examples in that paper are from historical Europe. So he uses the French case as an important one, but he does have some discussion of these things in Africa as well.
Okay, on that admonition to learn your historical demography, thank you so much, Tom.